was shaking in fear, walking into the West Wing of the White House. I sat in that welcoming room, and all I could think about was that moment. All I could think about was a baseball coach. All I could think about was a teacher, a professor here at Stonehill named Charlie Cerns. All I could think about was all of the people who in those moments where my life could have taken a different path lifted me up. It was that realization that stuck with me every single day as I walked into that amazing building. Whether you serve a Democrat or a Republican, you are an American at that moment. Walking in there, I repeated the same thing to myself on the way in the door and on the way out at night. Remember who you are and who you represent. You are not here because of any transcendent brilliance that you have. You're not here because you work harder than other people. You are here because your community has lifted you up. You didn't do it alone. Remember that. Today is an extraordinary day for you. But live deeply in that understanding that you are interdependent. You have been given a gift. The motto for Stonehill of light and hope. Education has given you some light to allow you to see. But don't take that ability to see as some indication that yours is the only path. Which leads me to my second lesson that I try to remember and live with deeply. One thing that I will never forget about those 8 years in Washington was, and you've all seen this on cable television, people yelling at each other, but never listening to one another. People talking at one another, but always waiting in those pauses to rebut and never to hear and to understand. People so firmly committed that theirs was the only repository of truth, the only way to do anything to the exclusion of others, has put us in this moment, this deep moment, where even though we are more connected than ever to one another, we lack connection. Connection where you actually see the person and hear the person, to understand them rather than to rebut. A couple of months ago, I was in a room on the south side of Chicago with 20 young people who are leaders in their community. All over the world came to Chicago. And they were engaging in this exercise where essentially two people sit knee to knee across from each other, eye to eye. And I watched people exchanging their personal story. And then the most amazing thing is, I then have to stand up and give the story that I just heard as if I were that person. Here is what I heard. I heard a young African-American man from one of the most difficult neighborhoods in the south side of Chicago stand up, and for that 2 minutes, he was a young woman from Aleppo, Syria. A young woman who spent 2 years in a refugee camp. A young woman who will never see her community, who lost most of her family. And as he was crying, he was ended by saying, I am going to devote the rest of my life to make sure this doesn't happen again. He was her. He saw her. I saw another young woman stand up and tell a story about how when she came out as a lesbian woman to her grandfather, that he turned away from her. She hugged him deeply and said, no matter how you turn away, I will always love you deeply. That young man was that young woman. And while none of us will ever be able to engage in that kind of deep empathy and exchange on a daily basis, please make sure that when you hear that inner voice saying that someone is automatically wrong, check yourself. Put yourself in their shoes. Understand their perspective. See where they're coming from. And the final thing that I want to leave you with begins with a story. I had the unbelievable honor to fly with the President Obama, to the 50th anniversary celebration of the signing of the Civil Rights Act in Austin, Texas. And when we got to the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, you walk into the rotunda, there are these amazing words on the wall: Medicare and Medicaid, voting rights, civil rights, and then I saw the word immigration. And when I saw the word immigration, right there I started to cry. The president looked at me and was like, "Really? Come on, man." The reason I did was because it was the Immigration Act of 1965 that allowed me, this Stonehill grad and a kid from Taunton, to be standing there as an assistant to the President of the United States of America. I then walked down the hall into a green room, and there was a gospel singer, this amazing woman named Mavis Staples, was watching a video of herself from 50 years before singing at a freedom rally. And standing behind her in that room was a hero of mine, Congressman John Lewis, who was saying in that amazing voice of his, "What a wondrous thing it is that I'm about to introduce Barack Obama on this day." An hour later in that same green room, there were 10 people who had written letters to the president. And as soon as he walked in the door, this one woman from Austin saw him, burst into tears, and said, "Mr. President, my little boy is alive today because of you." She kept on repeating that. She then turned to me, and obviously her tears had obscured her vision, because she said, "Young man," it's not that funny. Maybe a little. Said, "Young man, do you work for the president?" I stood up as straight as I could, and I said, "Yes, ma'am, I do." She said, "Please know that my little boy is alive today because of you." On the flight back to Washington, as I was reflecting on that hour and a half in my life, here's what I want you to remember. It wasn't a president or a Congress that were the driving force behind that Immigration Act that allowed my parents to move to this country. It was people in communities throughout the country that said things need to change and be better. Change is never top-down. Change is always bottom-up. It wasn't because of a Congress or a president that the Civil Rights Act was signed. It was because a 22-year-old named John Lewis and thousands of people like him stood on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, knowing that they were going to be beaten and thrown in jail. Why? Because of an idea. Change begins from the bottom up. And finally, it wasn't because of me, and it certainly wasn't because of Barack Obama, that this woman's son was alive. It was because people throughout the country said things need to be better. And so the takeaway for me here is that these are acts of citizenship and acts of hope. Something that is in short supply. But the thing that you have now, as graduates, is as you engage in your communities, understand that you have a responsibility of active citizenship. And I don't mean the piece of paper. I don't mean the degree, and I don't mean the paper that says you are a citizen. I mean that when you are in a community, don't just focus on what your rights are. Your rights are important, but as important are your responsibilities. And I don't just mean voting or registering to vote. That is a bare minimum. Your responsibility as graduates, as Stonehill graduates, light and hope, is no matter where you live and engage, if there is an elderly person down the street and you haven't seen the person for a week, knock on the door to make sure she's okay. That's community. When you see a young boy who lives in your community who is struggling, go to the school and read. That's community. That's leadership. Put aside the left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, constant Twitter-fed shouting match that parts people into us versus them, me against you, religion, race, gender. You have been given an amazing gift. You have a responsibility to engage. Because at the end of the day, I, someone who graduated from this place and cannot believe that I had the great honor to sit across in the Oval Office from the President of the United States, I will never forget that the greatest and most powerful office in this country is the office of citizen. As of today, you have been given light. It's time for you to fulfill the second part of the motto, which is hope. And hope is that belief that our destiny is not written for us, it is written by us. You are the change that you desire. Go out and do it. Congratulations, class of 2018.